Can a blood test predict Alzheimer's risk years before symptoms show up? The science is super real, but it's early and nuanced.
The blood tests can become positive up to 2 decades before someone actually starts developing symptoms.
If you're younger, your time to symptoms is longer than if you're older. And at age 60 has a roughly 20-year from positive blood test to symptom onset.
And that opens a whole different can of worms. Does everybody really want to know that they have a clock that's ticking?
Just because a test exists, doesn't mean always that the testing is better or worse. Today, we're unpacking a headline that almost sounds like science fiction. Can a blood test predict Alzheimer's risk years before symptoms show up? The short answer is kind of, but not in the way the headlines make it seem. The science is super real, but it's early and nuanced and much more useful in research right now than for telling an individual person, here's exactly when your memory problems are going to start. So we're going to do two things today. We're first going to talk about what the blood tests are actually measuring, and then we're going to talk about what this new paper in Nature adds beyond the headlines. So before we get into the paper, we're going to ground people. When the media says Alzheimer's blood test, what are we actually measuring?
So we're looking for a specific protein which is present in our blood and is a biomarker for Alzheimer's dementia. We hear about plaques and shadows that show up on brain scans for people who have Alzheimer's dementia. What we're looking for are the similar proteins that we see on the scans that we think are always present in the brain of individuals with Alzheimer's, but it's actually circulating in the bloodstream. And it's not only whether those protein levels are identified in the blood that matters, but it's also the dynamic changes in that blood protein's level predicts the speed with which symptoms from Alzheimer's can manifest. And what's really interesting about this study is that the blood tests can become positive up to 2 decades before someone actually starts developing symptoms. And that opens a whole different can of worms on whether that's clinically important or not. But I can't wait to get into this study.
Absolutely. So Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. It's the one most often referred to when we think about dementia. There are other causes, but it is the most common cause, and that was the focus of this study. So at the biological level, you guys all know, and our listeners know, I love to talk about cell-to-cell communication and how there are networks, social networks all throughout our body. That's no different in the brain. So our neurons, we have millions upon millions of connections, and they're sending signals constantly how to wake up when we're not awake, telling our body to breathe when we're awake, formulating thoughts in our day-to-day lives. And so there are chemicals that are permitting that messengers of signaling that allow communication to occur to have all those thoughts. And some of the specific tests that we're talking about here and in this study, they're well known in Alzheimer's disease. One is called amyloid plaques, which are basically kind of the garbage or waste of the cells after they've sent their messages. And when too much of that is not cleared out, that's where we got these plaques that become abnormally sticky. They stay and they accumulate over time. So as Shalana Truthi is saying, this is not something that occurs overnight, but over a rather long time. And tau is another protein that was a focus of this study, another protein where these amyloid plaques that are sticky that accumulate disrupt the kind of the network of tau, and that's where we end up with trouble with Alzheimer's disease development.
Exactly. So now that we have a little bit of a baseline, we're going to talk about the actual Nature Medicine study. The paper looked at plasma percent p-tau 217. Really complicated, but basically what it is it's not the raw amount of p-tau 217. It's actually the ratio of the phosphorylated to not phosphorylated tau at position 217. Now, the details are a little bit less important, but the clinical implications is why we want to talk about this. The researchers used 2 longitudinal cohorts and built what they called clock models. And basically what they were trying to do is estimate the age when someone crossed into biomarker positivity, which meant that the protein was high at a certain level in the blood, and then related that to the age when Alzheimer's symptoms developed years later. And they had one younger cohort and they had an older cohort, and they narrowed people down based on those biomarker values in a range where the biomarkers changed most consistently over time. And By that I mean increased. And from that, they built the models to estimate years from biomarker positivity. And what the paper found is that the estimated age of plasma percent p tau 217 positivity was associated with estimated age at symptom onset, with the model performance varying by cohort. But in the main analysis, the median absolute error for predicting age at symptom onset was about 3 to 4 years. Now, one of the most interesting findings from the paper, I thought, was that at age 60, like, so if someone had the percent p tau positive kind of result at age 60, they had a much longer median time to symptoms than someone being positive at age 80. So basically, what I'm saying is that if you're younger, your time to symptoms is longer than if you're older. That's kind of generally what they found in the model. And the paper gives this example of someone at age 60 has a roughly 20-year from positive blood test to symptom onset, and someone in around the age of 80 has about 11.4 years from positivity to symptom onset. And I wanted to kind of ask you guys, why do you think that is?
I think it makes sense, right? When what you're telling us is that this specific biomarker, which is the ratio of the phosphorylated versus the non-phosphorylated version of that specific protein, if we think of that as when the clock starts, people can develop symptoms at different rates. And for someone who's older to develop those symptoms before someone earlier than someone who is younger makes sense because a younger person has more brain reserve. Their brain has seen less of life, less of this world, less of the natural toxins and environmental exposures that we get as we spend more and more time on this planet. And they probably have less reserve when they're 80 versus when they're 60. So the changes that this protein is reflecting can lead to clinical symptoms a lot sooner.
What a remarkable advance this is. And as you said, Shalon, it's like we think of the word plasticity, and we use that in medicine a lot. Not plastic like the manufacturer that for your plastic water bottles, but it's just the ability to adapt. And the brain has such an immense reserve, an immense ability to adapt over time. And so, just this idea that it's not just months or years that this protein buildup starts to take place, but rather decades before anything might change that someone might notice in a loved one that or someone might notice themselves that memory is so altered and starts their physical and memory type of decline. It really speaks to the reserve of the brain. And the testing for basically a pinprick, potentially at home blood test to have about 90% or more accuracy is really remarkable that we've gotten to that point. And then, of course, it opens up a potential Pandora's box. If you've got this test and then if we're positive and it projects that maybe in 20 years you will develop dementia, Alzheimer's type or otherwise. What are the implications for that? And it's one of my personal heroes, Marvel's Thor, Chris Hemsworth, has a beautiful series in that, and he actually underwent genetic testing and found that he inherited the gene, and so the whole series is about the implications that he himself may develop, and he has that knowledge, and how does it affect his life with his family and knowing potentially what this future might bring.
I think that's really, really tricky. When, like, does everybody really want to know that they have a clock that's ticking and that they are 90 plus percent chance of developing Alzheimer's symptoms? I don't think everybody really wants to know. Now, maybe if someone has a family history and they know they're getting older and they're worried about seeing what kind of risk factors they can modify to improve their chances, it would really make sense. But think about all the unintended consequences of having a blood test and knowing that you may develop the symptoms of dementia. What is that going to impact your ability to get a job, your ability to get car insurance? If your car insurance is asking you, do you have a blood test that is going to potentially impact your driving ability in a few years? What about relationships? We know for other diseases like Huntington's disease, when people would test for the gene and they would discover that they have Huntington's disease, that caused marital conflicts and it led to partners thinking about whether they want to spend the rest of their lives with someone knowing that they're going to develop a specific medical problem down the line. So that's a great point you brought up.
I also think, as an oncologist, I frequently think about tests that we don't have solutions for, right? So in colon cancer specifically, right, we use the circulating tumor DNA test frequently, and sometimes it's used in the clinic as like, someone's had a cancer, it's been taken out, and then we're monitoring the blood to see if there's, cancer in the blood, but and that turns positive, but we can't see the cancer. We can't see it, and we don't have good drugs to make that cancer go away without seeing the cancer. And it kind of reminds me of that, right? Because it's like we don't have good intervention tools. There are drugs in clinical trials. I believe there's 2 drugs right now in clinical trials, trying to kind of remove that waste product that you were mentioning, Emil, earlier, from the blood so that it doesn't build up. And if those things work out, that would be wonderful and excellent. But right now, we don't have intervention. So, what is testing without intervention? To all of your points, and that could be across specialties.
Exactly right. And I was thinking a lot about ctDNA and cancer, in reading through this. And so it's a great analogy. Is test without potential intervention now, whether in the future, in addition to drugs, I can imagine the trials like people in exercise physiology space who do research might be looking about prescribing exercise as a way to try and clear out. Just like we're seeing in colon and other cancers, that prescribing exercise may decrease the chance that the cancer may come back or at least delay it. But yeah, it's hard. It's that you have the knowledge, and then the spike in anxiety, that potential is very real, right? So you can live, many years or maybe even decades in this case with knowledge of the test that could cause severe anxiety that can affect your life choices and those around you. And that's a hard thing to do. And then it comes to the central question is, medically, we're getting to the point where we're getting a better sensitive and specific test. And this is definitely an inroads, right? It's making a mark towards potentially a screening test for something that's a devastating disease, but we have to pair that with better understanding of research. And what would you do with this information, as with any medical test?
And we know diseases like Alzheimer's disease are not 100% genetic. We know a family history and age. Those are 2 dominant risk factors that can lead into someone developing Alzheimer's dementia. And you can't really modify your family history, and you can't really modify getting older. But you can modify your ability to exercise more. You can modify quitting smoking early. You can modify excessive alcohol intake, which are other risk factors that are known to increase the progression of Alzheimer's symptoms. So there is an opportunity. Granted, we don't have data on how much and how effectively changing someone's lifestyle is going to delay or prevent the onset of dementia symptoms down the line. But if somebody is already worried because of their family history and because they're getting older and now they know there's a clock ticking, they can probably institute behavioral changes that can lead to significant delays in how those symptoms manifest and really increase their functionality, their independence, reduce their ability to depend on other folks. So there is tremendous value in that space. And Shruti, to your point, before this study, people were doing clinical trials on anybody with a family history or anybody who's essentially worried about dementia. But now we have the ability to say, hey, this person is here on this specific clock, and we can standardize which patients we want to enroll in the study. I'm worried that some of the studies for Alzheimer's that were negative studies because we tested people who weren't going to develop dementia symptoms for decades. And we thought the intervention was negative when it wasn't really an intervention. We just picked the wrong people. So now we can select those patients better.
I think that's a really cool point. And again, you guys know my brain is pretty much always like finding some analogy with cancer. But you think about like, there's a lot of people that say like, why aren't we doing colonoscopies in everybody under the age of 45 also, right? Because of early onset increasing colon cancer. And it's something that a lot of us are thinking about where we want to do risk stratified, colonoscopy. Who are these people? We have to find the risk factors, then we have to find the people that are at the highest risk, and then we will be able to intervene in a meaningful way. And so this is kind of one step that the field of neurology has made forward to that, which is like a really good point, and something that I think maybe they'll rerun some of those drugs, in a biomarker selected kind of population. So I'm gonna basically just summarize what I think the New York Times headline kind of gets right and what it risks overselling. And so I think what it gets right is that this is a real advance in blood-based Alzheimer, biomarkers, and it could expand access compared to like PET and cerebrospinal fluid when people have to go in and get a tap. And I think what the science is moving from is, can we detect the pathology to can we estimate kind of future risk? And so I think that's cool. But what I do think it risks overselling, headlines, they tend to try to do that, is I don't think it's a good broad screening test for symptom-free people yet. And positive tests in asymptomatic people are harder to interpret in terms of timing and what it really means. And even the article itself notes, the New York Times article notes that people without cognitive symptoms, the positive result can be much more ambiguous. And the experts that they interviewed in the New York Times article recommended against these direct to consumer companies that are offering this test for now. And so this is actually the part that I think our listeners really want to hear, which is just because a test exists doesn't mean always that the testing is better or worse. And so, if you had the choice to order this for a patient, a patient comes to you and it says, hey, like, I want to get this test. What do you think about it? What would you say?
I will say I want to give credit to the authors of this study because in the conclusion, what they made, and it's in there in the abstract, is that they said this is essentially a functional validation of a test that can be used in prospective clinical trials. And I applaud them for that. What they're saying is, here we're working in the lab, we're developing a test for something that may herald Alzheimer's disease, but the punchline is from them that the clinical trials are needed. Here's a tool that they can do alongside, whether it's interventional treatments to try and prevent or people with Alzheimer's, and definitely use this tool. And any of these blood-based or other kind of tests always require validation. So I give them credit for having said that.
I know the author said that this is a test that you can use for clinical trials, but this test is available for people to buy off the shelf. It was FDA
Yeah.
cleared last year. It's available for individuals, and people are going to ask for this, and people are getting the test. The one thing I want to remind folks is that we have to look at the population in which this test was validated. The two cohorts that they evaluated and showed the timeline and the effectiveness of the blood test and the change in the blood test are more than 90% white participants. We know a Black older individual has 2 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia than white patients. Hispanic patients have 1.5 times the risk of developing dementia compared to white patients. So I don't really know how well this test is going to perform in a non-white population. So if you're someone who has a family history, is worried about these symptoms, happens to be white, this test may perform much better than it does in other individuals. So I think everyone's mileage may vary, but I don't think that this test is ready for mass testing for Alzheimer's risk the way we do, let's say, mammograms or colonoscopies to screen for cancer. I think we have a lot of work to do before we can do population level testing using this specific assay.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I agree. I I agree, and I also think though that I could understand wanting to know. It goes back to just what we were talking about before, where there's going to be some people that are just like, I want to plan. I want to know what my future looks like. I want to plan. I want to get this test. And so I can kind of empathize with wanting to get the test. I don't think that this test, that's what it all comes down to when we talk about a lot of these tests. Again, the cancer multi-cancer screening test is another example. The tests, I think, just need to be better at this current stage. And once the tests get better, we will be able to roll it out to everybody. So that's kind of my
Yeah.
take. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, I would say cart before the horse for it to be stocking on the shelves, but I would hope that people going and getting those tests are having in-depth conversations, not just with their physicians, their care teams, but also their families, and just carefully considering what are the implications of getting such a test. But I'm always a proponent in any field, oncology, is our specialty, and others. for prospective, well-designed clinical trials and having this integrated for further validation that the test is actually a valid test to begin with. And then hand in hand with other interventions, I hope that will be done in that field.
Yeah, this is a tremendously important test for the field of Alzheimer's dementia and for the field of drug development for this extremely devastating disease, which leads to a lot of morbidity, a lot of dysfunction for individuals in the older stages of life. So really rooting to see how this develops in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening and joining us. We will be unpacking a new study next week.